In the winter of 1944, the war in Europe was entering its darkest phase. Cities were burning, armies were collapsing, and deep inside Nazi-controlled territory, thousands of prisoners waited in silence behind barbed wire fences. Most people believed nothing could be done for them anymore. But one Canadian soldier refused to accept that. His name rarely appeared in headlines. He wasn't a famous general. He didn't command a massive army. Yet the plan he proposed would eventually save tens of thousands of lives. At first, almost everyone thought he had lost his mind. The story began far from the front lines. In a crowded military office in London, Allied officers were reviewing intelligence reports from occupied Europe. Most of the reports were grim. Transport trains, prison camps, entire communities disappearing. The numbers were hard to ignore. Thousands, then tens of thousands, were being moved deeper into German territory. Many Allied officers believed the same thing. There was nothing the military could realistically do. The war itself was already pushing resources to the limit. But among the officers reading those reports was a quiet Canadian intelligence officer. And what he saw in those documents changed everything. He noticed something strange. The camps holding thousands of prisoners were not always heavily guarded. Many were located near railway lines that were already damaged by bombing. And in several regions, German command structures were beginning to break down. To most officers, those details meant nothing. To him, they meant opportunity. He began sketching a plan. Not a military assault. Something far more unusual. Something that depended on speed, deception, and courage. When he first explained the idea, the room fell silent. The officer proposed sending small Allied teams into unstable regions near the camps. Not to attack, but to negotiate local surrenders, disrupt transport orders, and convince German officers that the war was already lost. If they succeeded, thousands of prisoners could be released before they were transferred deeper into Germany. If they failed, the teams would be trapped behind enemy lines. One British officer leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "That's not a rescue plan," he said. "That's suicide." The Canadian officer didn't argue. Instead, he calmly laid out the numbers. He showed them railway maps, communication gaps between German units, areas where Allied advances were already collapsing enemy authority. If even a few local commanders surrendered early, entire camps could open their gates without a single shot being fired. But most commanders still refused to approve it. The idea sounded reckless, unpredictable, and far outside normal military doctrine. One officer reportedly laughed and said, "Only a madman would try something like that." For a moment, it seemed the plan would disappear into a forgotten folder. Just another desperate idea during a desperate war. But then, something unexpected happened. Someone higher up in command read the proposal, and instead of rejecting it, he asked a simple question. How soon can this Canadian start? Within weeks, small teams began preparing for a mission that officially didn't exist. No medals were promised. No headlines were expected. But if the plan worked, tens of thousands of prisoners might live to see the end of the war. And the man everyone called crazy would soon prove that sometimes the most impossible ideas are the ones that change history. By early 1944, the idea that had once been laughed at inside Allied headquarters was no longer just a proposal. It had quietly become a mission. But, officially, it didn't exist. No public orders were written. No official announcements were made. Only a handful of officers even knew the operation had begun. The Canadian officer who had proposed the risky plan was now standing inside a dim operations room somewhere in southern England. On the wall behind him hung a massive map of occupied Europe. Red pins marked railway lines. Blue circles marked prison camps. And small pencil marks showed something far more dangerous. Regions where German command was beginning to collapse. The Allied advance was getting closer every week, but time was running out. Intelligence reports suggested that thousands of prisoners were being moved eastward, deeper into territory that might not be reached before the war ended. If that happened, those prisoners might disappear forever. That was the reason the Canadian officer's plan had finally been approved. Not because it was safe, but because it might be the only chance left. Instead of large military units, the mission would rely on very small teams. Just a few soldiers, carefully selected, fluent in several languages, trained to move quickly and quietly behind unstable front lines. Their goal wasn't to fight battles, it was something far more unpredictable. They had to reach camps, transport hubs, and local German commanders before new evacuation orders were carried out. If they could convince those commanders that the war was already lost, entire camps might surrender peacefully. But if the Germans suspected a trick, the teams would be surrounded immediately. One cold morning, the first group gathered near a quiet military airfield. There were no speeches, no ceremony, just a small transport aircraft waiting on the runway. Inside the aircraft were several men who understood exactly how dangerous the mission was. One of them quietly asked the Canadian officer a question before boarding. "What happens if they refuse to listen?" The officer didn't hesitate. "Then we try the next commander." It sounded simple, but everyone standing there knew the truth. They would be entering territory where the rules of war had already begun to break down. Hours later, the aircraft crossed the dark skies over occupied Europe. Below them were forests, rail lines, and scattered towns that had been under German control for years. Somewhere in those territories were thousands of prisoners waiting behind barbed wire fences. They didn't know help was coming, and the rescue teams didn't know if they would arrive in time. The first landing zone was a remote farming region not far from a railway junction. According to intelligence reports, trains transporting prisoners passed through the area almost every week. If those trains continued moving east, the prisoners might never be seen again. As the small Allied team moved through the countryside, they quickly realized something strange. German authority in the region was already beginning to weaken. Some checkpoints were abandoned. Others were manned by exhausted soldiers who looked more confused than confident. The war was changing faster than anyone expected, and that created an opportunity. 2 days later, the team finally reached their first objective, a detention camp holding several thousand prisoners. The barbed wire fences were still standing. Guard towers were still manned. But something about the place felt different. The guards looked nervous. Rumors of the advancing Allied armies were spreading quickly. Inside the camp, prisoners had already begun hearing whispers that the war might soon be over, but none of them believed rescue could happen so suddenly. The Canadian officer approached the camp with only a small escort. No heavy weapons, no armored vehicles, just confidence. At the entrance gate, a German officer stepped forward to confront them. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The air felt frozen. The German commander finally broke the silence. "You are very far from your own lines," he said carefully. The Canadian officer looked directly at him. "Yes," he replied, "and so are you." What happened next would decide the fate of thousands of prisoners, and it would prove whether the plan everyone once called crazy could actually work. But the German officer hadn't made his decision yet, and the entire mission now depended on the next few words spoken at that gate. For several long seconds, nothing moved at the camp entrance. The wind pushed softly against the barbed wire fences. A loose metal sign rattled somewhere near the gate. Behind the German commander, nervous guards stood in silence, and behind them, thousands of prisoners watched. Many of them had already learned not to hope. They had seen too many rumors, too many false promises. So, when they noticed the small group of Allied soldiers standing outside the camp, most of them didn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make sense. Rescue missions didn't happen like this, not with only a handful of soldiers. The German commander studied the Canadian officer carefully. He looked tired. The war had clearly taken its toll. His uniform was still perfectly arranged, but his eyes told a different story. "Do you really expect me to surrender this camp?" he asked slowly, "to a group of men who barely outnumber my guards?" The Canadian officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. Instead, he simply stepped closer to the gate. "The war is ending," he said calmly. "You know it. I know it. Your soldiers know it." The German commander didn't respond, but his eyes moved briefly toward the horizon. Somewhere far away, faint artillery thunder rolled across the countryside. The front line was moving closer, every hour. The Canadian officer continued. "If you keep these prisoners here," he said, "you will soon be surrounded. Your supply lines are already collapsing. Your reinforcements will not arrive. And when the Allied armies reach this place—" He paused. The guards around the gate were listening now. "So, you have a choice." For a moment, it seemed like the German officer might refuse. One of the guards tightened his grip on his rifle. Another nervously adjusted his helmet. Inside the camp, prisoners pressed closer to the fences, trying to understand what was happening. Some whispered to each other. Others simply stared in silence. The Canadian officer slowly removed a folded map from his coat. He spread it across a wooden crate near the gate. Red arrows covered the map. Allied advances from multiple directions. Railway lines already cut by bombing. German positions shrinking every day. "You are here," he said, pointing to a small mark on the paper. "And these armies," he pointed again, "will be here soon." The German commander studied the map for a long time. His expression slowly changed. The confidence he once carried as a commander was beginning to fade. Because deep down, he already knew the truth. The war was slipping away. Finally, he looked back at the Canadian officer. "You are asking me to surrender," he said. The Canadian officer shook his head. "No. I'm asking you to save lives." Another long silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. The German commander turned toward the guards behind him. He gave a short, quiet order. At first, the guards hesitated. They looked confused. One of them even asked the officer to repeat the command. But this time, the words were clear. "Open the gate." A heavy metal lock clicked. The sound echoed across the camp like a thunderclap. Slowly, the large iron gate began to move. For a moment, the prisoners inside the camp didn't react. They simply stared, because after years of fear, hunger, and uncertainty, freedom felt impossible. Then, one prisoner stepped forward. An older man with thin shoulders and tired eyes. He walked carefully toward the open gate, almost as if he expected someone to stop him. No one did. Another prisoner followed. Then another. Within minutes, hundreds of people were moving toward the entrance. Some were crying. Others were simply too exhausted to speak. The Canadian soldiers helped them step through the gate, guiding them carefully away from the fences. But the Canadian officer knew something important. This was only the beginning. There were other camps, other trains, other commanders who might not be willing to listen, and somewhere ahead. The most dangerous part of the mission was still waiting, because the next camp was controlled by a commander who had already sworn he would never surrender. News of the first camp's surrender spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, word traveled through nearby villages, rail stations, and German checkpoints. Some soldiers quietly abandoned their posts. Others simply waited, unsure of what would happen next. But not everyone was ready to give up. 2 days after the first camp opened its gates, the Canadian team received new intelligence. Another detention camp was located less than 50 kilometers away, but this one was different, much larger, and much more dangerous. According to reports, the camp commander was a strict officer who had already made his position very clear. He had reportedly told his guards only one thing: no one leaves this camp. The Canadian officer studied the map carefully. Inside that camp were thousands more prisoners. If the camp was evacuated toward Germany, the prisoners could disappear into the chaos of the collapsing front lines. There would be no way to track them. no way to reach them, and the opportunity to save them would vanish. So the Canadian officer made a decision. They would try the same approach again, but this time the risk was far greater, because the commander waiting inside that camp had a reputation for being stubborn, disciplined, and extremely loyal to orders. The team arrived near the camp just before sunset. From a distance, the place looked far more secure than the first camp. Tall guard towers stood at every corner. Heavy barbed wire fences surrounded the entire compound. Armed soldiers patrolled the perimeter in careful patterns. Even from far away, the tension in the air was obvious. As the Canadians approached the gate, several German guards immediately raised their rifles. "Stop where you are!" The command echoed across the entrance road. For a moment, everything froze. The Canadian officer slowly raised his hands to show he carried no weapon. "We're here to speak with your commander," he said calmly. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them disappeared into a nearby guardhouse. Several long minutes passed. Finally, the gate opened just enough for one officer to step outside. He was taller than most of the soldiers around him. His uniform was perfectly arranged. And, unlike the commander at the previous camp, this man did not look tired. He looked angry. "You have 10 seconds to explain why you're here," the German officer said coldly. The Canadian officer stepped forward. "The war is ending," he said. "You know it." The German commander didn't even glance at the map the Canadian officer held. Instead, he stepped closer. "So, you came here with a handful of men to convince me to surrender my command?" The tone of his voice made it clear what he thought about the idea. The Canadian officer remained calm. "You've heard the artillery," he said quietly. "Allied armies are moving in every direction. There is no reason for anyone here to die during the final weeks of the war." The German commander stared at him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the officer suddenly laughed. "You think this camp will surrender because you ask politely?" The guards behind him tightened their grip on their weapons. Several soldiers began surrounding the Canadians. One wrong move could end the mission immediately. The German commander gave a sharp order. 2 soldiers stepped forward. "Search them!" The tension instantly changed. If the Canadians were arrested now, the entire mission would collapse. Thousands of prisoners would remain trapped behind the fences. But the Canadian officer didn't resist. He simply stood still as the soldiers checked his coat. Then he spoke again. "You're a professional officer," he said calmly. "You understand what happens when a war ends." The German commander narrowed his eyes. "You're in no position to lecture me." The Canadian officer slowly looked toward the guard towers surrounding the camp, then back at the commander. "You still have time to make a decision that saves lives." The commander stepped closer. "Or what?" he asked. For the first time since arriving, the Canadian officer spoke with complete certainty. "Or this place becomes a battlefield." Silence spread across the entrance road. Even the guards seemed unsure what would happen next. The German commander stared at him, and for a moment it looked like he might give the order to arrest the entire team, but just as the tension reached its highest point, a distant sound rolled across the countryside. Low, heavy, unmistakable. Artillery, and it was getting closer. The commander slowly turned his head toward the horizon. Smoke could be seen rising far away. The front line was moving faster than anyone expected. Now the commander faced a decision he could no longer ignore. But whether he would open the gates, or turn the camp into a final battlefield, was something the Canadians were about to find out. The distant thunder of artillery continued to roll across the countryside. It was no longer just a rumor. The war was reaching the camp. For several seconds, no one at the gate moved. The German commander stood completely still, staring toward the horizon where the smoke was rising. Even the guards seemed uncertain. They had followed orders for years, but now those orders were beginning to collide with reality. The Canadian officer said nothing. He didn't push, he didn't threaten. He simply waited, because he understood something important. At that moment, the German commander was no longer deciding between surrender and resistance. He was deciding between 2 very different endings. one that would save thousands of lives, and one that would turn the camp into a battlefield. The artillery sounded again, closer this time. Somewhere in the distance, the faint rumble of armored vehicles echoed across the hills. The front line was collapsing faster than anyone inside the camp had expected. The German commander slowly looked back at the Canadian officer. "You believe they will reach us soon," he said. The Canadian officer nodded once. "Yes." The commander turned and looked at the camp behind him. Thousands of prisoners were standing behind the fences. Some had climbed onto crates just to see what was happening near the gate. Others stood quietly in long rows, watching in silence. They didn't know the details of the conversation, but they could feel something changing. For years, the commander had believed his duty was simple: follow orders, maintain control, hold the camp. But now the war that created those orders was disappearing, and the consequences of his next decision would last far longer than the war itself. He looked again toward the horizon. The distant thunder of artillery continued. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "This war is already lost." No one around him responded, but everyone heard the words. The commander slowly turned back toward his soldiers. For a moment it seemed like time itself had stopped. Then he gave an order, not shouted, not dramatic, just a few calm words. "Open the gates!" The guards hesitated. Several of them looked at each other, unsure if they had heard correctly. But the commander repeated the order. "Open the gates!" Heavy locks began to turn. Metal chains rattled against the iron gate. The sound echoed across the entire camp. Inside the fences, thousands of prisoners watched in complete silence. Some didn't dare move. Others held their breath, because after years of fear and uncertainty, they could hardly believe what they were seeing. Slowly, the massive gate began to open. For a moment, no one stepped forward. Then a young boy moved first. He walked carefully toward the entrance, holding his mother's hand. A Canadian soldier stepped forward and gently helped them across the threshold. The moment they passed the gate, something changed. More prisoners began moving. First dozens, then hundreds. Soon, thousands of exhausted men, women, and children were walking through the open gate. Some cried openly. Others simply stared at the sky as if they had forgotten what freedom felt like. The Canadian soldiers worked quickly, helping people move safely away from the camp. Medical teams that had been waiting nearby began distributing water and food. For many prisoners, it was the first real meal they had seen in months. But the Canadian officer who had started the mission was already studying his notes, because he understood something remarkable. This camp was not the only one that had opened its gates. In the days that followed, similar negotiations spread across several regions where German authority had begun collapsing. Some commanders surrendered quietly. Others simply abandoned their posts. Camp after camp began releasing prisoners. Weeks later, as the war in Europe finally came to an end, the full scale of the mission became clear. Through negotiations, early surrenders, and disrupted transports, an estimated 38,000 prisoners had escaped the fate waiting for them deeper inside collapsing Nazi territory. Thousands of families survived because a small group of soldiers believed something others called impossible. The Canadian officer who proposed the plan never described himself as a hero. In fact, many people barely knew his name. But the people who walked through those gates never forgot what had happened. Because sometimes history doesn't change because of massive armies or famous generals. Sometimes it changes because one person refuses to believe that nothing can be done. And the idea that everyone once called crazy ended up saving 38,000 lives. The distant thunder of artillery continued to roll across the countryside. It was no longer just a rumor. The war was reaching the camp. For several seconds, no one at the gate moved. The German commander stood completely still, staring toward the horizon where the smoke was rising. Even the guards seemed uncertain. They had followed orders for years, but now those orders were beginning to collide with reality. The Canadian officer said nothing. He didn't push, he didn't threaten. He simply waited. because he understood something important. At that moment, the German commander was no longer deciding between surrender and resistance. He was deciding between two very different endings. One